Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot for this nice introduction. I think this is really a bit of a different angle because first of all, I will focus on introducing this idea of a social dilemma. And then this is of course mostly done in experiments, and I will just give a theoretical angle and just mention some experimental results, but we can maybe discuss this later. And when I prepared this, I realized that every single of these projects that I will speak about involves one postdoc who left for Toronto, Maria Abu-Chakra. So I should somehow acknowledge this from the start, that every single project has her handwriting in it. Okay, so when you think about this topic, I mean, this is not new. I mean, now we discuss sustainability a lot. This is a book that that I found actually many years ago in the bookshelf of my parents. This is 1972, Limits of Growth. And in those days, we still thought, okay, somehow we have to argue that not everything can be exponential at all times. And then later, when I was grown up, there was Al Gore who wrote this Earth in Balance, which is to me already something that is very different in terms of the title. It's no longer growth, it's somehow now balance. And around the same time, people wrote books like could we halve resource use, so actually go down in things. And the dynamics to me is interesting, and I think socially it's interesting, because if you look at world population growth, in my lifetime, we have seen approximately a doubling of population size, but at the same time, the growth rate has reduced by a factor of 2. So I think it's an interesting time to be here, because in the 1950s, growth seemed to be possible at all times, and now every projection shows you that with this demographic transition, you're moving into a different regime. But that doesn't remove the problem that we currently have. So, and this problem has been discussed in the literature for many, many years, and one famous paper on this is The Tragedy of the Commons. This is an article written by Garrett Hardin in 1968, and the basic idea is that you have somehow a common meadow in the middle of your village, and you can send your cows or other animals there, and everything is fine as long as everybody sends a single animal. But if I send a second animal, the resource is still not really overused yet, but I have 2 animals that benefit from this common good. But if everybody does it, it's somehow a problem. Somehow this paper is sometimes frowned upon because it's also about population regulation, and there's a sentence in there that the freedom to breed is unacceptable. So he speaks a lot about how humans should restrict having offspring in societies and how they should enforce this among each other. But there is another paper that discusses the same thing in terms of the fisheries, and that's Scott Gordon, 1954. He essentially makes the same argument. If you have a big ocean with the common resource, fish in this case, everybody would benefit as long as you have a single fisher boat. Then you have a certain amount of catch and everything is sustainable. But then if you start thinking, okay, what would happen if I buy a second boat? If I buy a second boat, I just approximately double my catch. But of course, I also use the resource more. And if everybody does this, there's some sort of overexploitation of the resource. And so this paper was written in 1954, and if you look at this many years later, and this is a picture of the of fish stock, and the argument here is that in the 1950s, most fish stocks globally were underexploited and some were fully exploited, but at this time already they started to overexploit certain fish stock. And later in the 1960s and especially in the 1990s, many of them crashed, so they have collapsed. So there's really an overuse of this resource. And that was already predicted back in the 1950s could happen if we don't watch things. So now the problem is that most of you don't have fisher boats and most of you don't have cows, so it's a bit hard to relate. And another problem where there's a common good is described in this article about 15, 20 years ago, digital cows grazing on digital grounds. And this is about similar problem in the digital commons. And there are resources here, they're not really being overexploited, because if I read Wikipedia, it's not that I destroy the good for somebody else, but still it takes people to really contribute to these goods. So they have to be built up by people who are volunteering, who are supporting this. And this is an example for Wikipedia. This is a Plattdeutsch Wikipedia. This is from the local language of Northern Germany. There's a whole Wikipedia with all kinds of articles. Of course, the question you also have to ask is, what is the cost of contributing and what's the benefit? So I can imagine that most of you will not be interested in reading this if I write an article about game theory in the Plattdeutsch Wikipedia. But it's still there, it exists. And another thing where it's much more popular is actually GitHub. I mean, most people who develop some sort of software use GitHub and they make their code publicly available. And that's an interesting problem, because why would you do this? I mean, you can, of course, always use somebody else's code, but why would you always kind of share your code with others, and why would you share your work? And I mean, the basic problem is essentially kind of, how do people contribute as a personal cost to something that is a benefit to a lot of people? So this was just a short introduction, and next I want to come to the kind of the more mathematically, but it's not very mathematical, the description of linear public goods games as social dilemmas, because that's kind of the workhorse in this field. And later I will go to kind of other models that are kind of more suited to, yeah, maybe climate change or associated problems. So how do we model a social dilemma? And typically this is introduced as a game between individuals that somehow play together. And in the simplest setting, you just assume that there are a number of players, and each player can contribute 0 or 10 euros anonymously into a common pool. So you can pay into this, or you can just not pay into this. And in the end, I take the pool, I double this sum, and I distribute it among all n players. And the basic question is, what will you do and what should you do? There are many possible results. One is that everybody contributes. Every player pays 10 euros. It's doubled. And in the end, I walk home with 10 euros more than I had initially. So that's the simplest solution, where you think, okay, this is great. But it could also happen that nobody contributes. And then nobody puts anything in. 0 is doubled and distributed, so nobody earns anything. You walk home with the same amount of money that you had. But these are kind of boring solutions. So we typically kind of call these people who contribute then cooperators, and those who don't, defectors. And it's getting much more interesting if you mix the two. And mixing the two could, for example, happen in a way that only I contribute, but nobody else does. So I pay 10 euros into this pool. This is double, there are 20 euros. But if there are, say, 100 people, people essentially earn nothing, and I also lose these 10 euros. So essentially, I use 10 euros to distribute a very little amount of money to everyone. So that's a strange solution, or a strange kind of way to play this game. But another way would be kind of that only the others contribute, but I do not. So if all of you contribute 10 euros, this is doubled. So it's kind of essentially it's the number of players times 2 times 10 that is in the pool. And that means that everybody gets approximately 20 euros out of the pool. So you also paid 10, so you only earned 10, but I paid nothing, so I earn approximately 20 euros. That's for me a wonderful solution, not so much for the rest of this group. So how do we kind of put this into equation? So this is a payoff of somebody who wants to cooperate in such a game. And this payoff has kind of certain elements here. Kind of one is this multiplicator. So in the example, we used 2. I said the amount of money is doubled. Then there's a cost. In the example, it was 10 euros. So how much does it cost to contribute in this game? Of course, I mean, there are many variants of this, where this can be kind of chosen in any way, or kind of many other variants. But in the simplest example, there's just a fixed cost, and you can contribute or not. And then there's the group size, of course, and then there's the number of cooperators. And the associated kind of payoff for defectors is just the same, because they get the same out of the pool, but they don't pay the cost. And if you plot here the number of cooperators, so this is this J that ranges from 0 to n, and here you plot the payoff. If nobody contributes, then the payoff is 0 for everyone, and everybody is a defector. If everybody contributes, the payoff is C times R minus 1, because then the J is equal to n, and then it's just kind of C times R minus 1. Then you end up here. And the question is now, how should you play in this game? And the assumption in evolutionary game theory is always, you're not so much into what the others are getting, but much more into what you are getting. So that's the only thing that you really want to optimize. You want to be a successful player. You want to optimize this payoff. And wherever you are here, whatever the number of cooperators, if you switch from cooperation to defection, you walk a little bit to the left, because there's one cooperator less, that's you, but the payoff is increased. Your payoff is increased, because kind of by moving to the left, you walk from this blue line from the cooperator payoff to the defector payoff, to the red line. And that means that suddenly you get much more. You seem to get much more, because I mean, in the long run, of course, everybody will do this. And that means there is selection going to the left. I mean, in evolutionary biology, we think about selection, like successful strategies spread through evolution, because I play successfully in this game, I have more offspring. So yeah, in the end, people will be like me. So cooperation goes down. We could also think of learning. I look at all the other players, and some of them are performing worse, some are performing better, and eventually people will adopt that strategy. So you have somehow kind of some dynamics that goes to the left, reducing the number of cooperators. But but the sad thing is now that while you're moving to the left, this yellow line is the average payoff of the population. This goes down. And that means that a behavior that is beneficial for the individual, but detrimental for the whole group is spreading. And the total fitness of the population is going down. So eventually we end up in a situation where nobody cooperates, although cooperation for everybody, if everybody would cooperate, that would be the social optimum. But this situation is inherently unstable. And the question in this field is really, how do you stabilize cooperation? How do you get there? So in evolutionary game theory, we just make this assumption that successful strategies spread via evolution or social learning. So let's assume I'm the only defector. So you are all making your blood donations, and whenever somebody has an accident, there's enough kind of blood available in the hospital. But I don't like blood donations, so that doesn't matter. There's still enough blood for everyone. But as soon as everybody stops donating, we have a problem in the whole system. And this is the essence. So as long as single individuals deviate, it doesn't really matter. But as soon as there are too many, then the common good really breaks down. So there are tons of examples of this in biology. I mean, this, for example, blood sharing in vampire bats that go hunting, and if they're not successful, they share with others. There are army ants here. Kind of, in general, kind of social insects have a very interesting organization, which goes back to the genetics. That there are kind of individuals that don't have any offspring, but they still kind of contribute to the kind of ant community or ant society here. It's another ant example, which do also agriculture. They're kind of monkeys in taking care of each other in a reciprocal way. So they, for example, scratch somebody else's back, and then somebody scratches their back. So there's a big discussion kind of how you can get cooperation, and kind of in this field, people have identified lots and lots of different mechanisms. One is direct and indirect reciprocity. Direct means I help you today and you help me tomorrow. And indirect means I help somebody today, and that gives me a good reputation, and somebody else might help me. But this is something that we typically assume for higher organisms, because for direct reciprocity, you have to recognize who has helped you before. And for indirect, it's actually more complicated. You have to know who did what. And then there's, of course, kind of population structure. If you have a structured population, it can be much easier. It can also be harder, but it can be easier because you have a fixed neighborhood. Something that is frowned upon in evolutionary biology is group selection, where you have a population structure that acts as if there would be different kind of teams competing with each other. And this can lead kind of to cooperation within the team if there is somehow a conflict between teams. But the problem is that group selection always requires that a group somehow reproduces, or that the dynamics is in such a way that kind of groups act as if they would reproduce, and that's typically complicated. It kind of a more popular explanation in evolutionary biology is kin selection, where you assume that the genetic relatedness matters. And the simplest way to think about kin selection is actually, to me, not in social insects, but it's in it's a statement by Haldane, who said, "I will jump into the river to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins." So if it's only about the survival of your genes, it doesn't matter if I survive or if 2 of my brothers survive, because essentially since I share kind of a certain amount of genes with them, it makes sense to save 2 of them, or 8 cousins in the end. So one thing that I briefly wanted to mention is indirect reciprocity, where so this is a very neat experiment that has been kind of discussed controversial in the past years, but I think it's a very, very nice setup. And the idea is here that at a coffee machine, you can also kind of get milk into the coffee, but the milk is paid by volunteer donations. And so they put just kind of some device there to collect money. And what they did is this is the number of the amount of money that has been paid for the milk that is consumed. And so every other week they put a picture of flowers, and every other week they put a picture of eyes. And if you feel you're being watched, if you feel that there's some reputation involved, then you tend to pay more in this experiment. This is just, I mean, I know that you can discuss this experiment controversially, but to me, it's very interesting to see that these subtle signals can be enough to actually kind of lead to some cooperation. So to sum up this part is kind of this, in this evolution of cooperation, there are several mechanisms that can stabilize cooperation, meaning that if you have cooperation, you don't get away from it. And some of them can even lead to the de novo evolution of cooperation. So even if you start from defection, some of these mechanisms can lead to a transition from a defective state to a cooperative state. But that depends on the details of these mechanisms. So can we transfer at least some of these ideas to the problem of climate change? And that has been done for many years in various ways. But typically in climate change, we think of a very large group. And the known mechanisms for cooperation become quite inefficient. At least kind of on this theoretical side, there's usually the population size involved somewhere. And it's difficult to have a mechanism that is really efficient for very large groups. Then of course you can subdivide the group, but it's a problem if you have very large groups. And then there are of course additional complications. And the additional complications are, for example, you have physical thresholds. So once a glacier is gone, it's not coming back in a linear fashion anymore. So there's really a threshold effect in terms of kind of, changing the environment in a certain way. And then there are also political thresholds. And I would argue that the 2-degree target is not really a physical one. It's something that people have agreed on that this is a target that is meaningful to us, but but nobody tells you that it's not 1.5 or 3 degrees. I mean, of course, it's getting much worse if it's higher, but it's not something that immediately you look at the physics of the problem and you say, okay, it's 2 degrees. No, it's something that we have to agree on to have a certain kind of common goal. And another kind of maybe even more serious problem is that the benefits occur mostly in the future, but the costs already accumulate today. So to do something kind of for sustainability in the long run is something that costs us today, but maybe it doesn't benefit us today. And some of the benefits only arise for future generations. And I mean, to me, it's always a bit difficult to speak about benefits here, because essentially, if I think, for example, kind of about the kind of oceans rising in the level, of course, it's not really a benefit that they stay low. It's just the avoidance of a cost. But I mean, for the purpose of this talk, I just speak about benefits as something positive from cooperation here. So let me go on with collective risk gains. And the collective risk game goes back to this landmark paper by Manfred Wilinski, who has kind of worked on the problem of cooperation many years earlier, but who has also kind of developed this to look at these threshold effects that are particularly interesting. And the game is the following. So again, kind of n players, in this case, obtain kind of 2R euros. And each player can contribute 0, 1, or 2 euros over a certain number of rounds. And if the group contributed more than some threshold, which is here the number of players times the number of rounds, so on average, everybody should just pay 1 euro each round, then it's fine. Then each player can keep what she did not contribute. And that means, you really want to be above this threshold, because if you're below, then you lose whatever you did not contribute with a certain probability, say kind of 90%. And so this is an example where kind of the total contributions kind of were rising over the number of rounds, and in the end they kind of were above the threshold, so people can keep what they have not contributed. But in this other example, you fail to reach the target, and then you lose what you didn't contribute with a certain probability, which is kind of usually assumed to be high. So what should I do in such a game? And kind of one possibility would be that here there's 10 players. They play over a certain number of rounds, and they need to reach a target of 100. Here, everybody contributed 12 in total. And so with 10 players, that's 120. The target is 100. So these are too many contributions. We're actually beyond the threshold, and there's an incentive to give less. So if everybody contributes 10 in each round, the goal is reached, and there's no incentive to change. If you're below the threshold, the goal is just not reached, and you cannot change it. A single individual cannot change the system. And we always think about single individuals adjusting their choices here. So if you did not reach the goal, you'd have an incentive to give less here. It could also be a different situation where players give very different amounts of money. But in the end, they end up with 98. And in this case, the goal is just missed, So everybody has an incentive to give more, because my own contribution could really make a difference now. And in this case, it's also kind of the goal is reached. There's no incentive to change because it's 100 in total, but I feel it's totally unfair. I mean, if I contributed 16, why do I accept that others contribute 2? But still, if I deviate from 16, it's only getting worse for me. So there are many, many solutions for this, and many of them are just not fair, or they do not seem to be fair. And so Manfred Milinski has done experiments on this and asked him, how do humans play such a game? And this is kind of from this 2008 paper. And this is kind of how the amount of money kind of changes with the number of rounds. And the interesting thing, let's focus on the blue line here. The black thing is the target, that approximately 50% of the groups do not even reach the goal when the probability is 90%. And on average, the goal is just missed. So that's kind of the worst case scenario. So you really don't want to just miss the goal. You want to be above it or kind of way below it. So they also kind of give approximately the equal amounts. So somehow this equality in the system is kind of, at least when humans play, is somehow something that you at least observe. And they even give something when it doesn't seem to make any sense. So I mean, the incentive here was, so how do you actually kind of build a benefit in this? And they said kind of, we use this money that they contribute to the pool to make the public aware of this problem. But kind of if the probability is very low that you lose something, your own benefit would be much higher if you don't contribute anything. So this framing in terms of climate change actually kind of helps people to become more cooperative. So the question what Manfred and his colleagues did is they did behavioral experiments to see what people are really doing. And what I'm interested in is kind of, is this actually a stable strategy? What is a good strategy in such a game? And to do this, kind of we developed kind of an evolutionary model where we just argue that kind of a strategy that leads to a high payoff should spread in a population. And then in the end, you can ask which strategy is particularly stable. So so there are many good strategies, but which ones are those that are really stable and that cannot really be invaded by something? And this is work that has been done by Maria. And so one very good strategy in this game, theoretically very good strategy. I mean, here you see that kind of psychologically people behave differently. But a very good strategy is that you start contributing very late. So let's assume you have to invest 50% of your income. Then you start investing very late, and then you just make it to the target. And the point is, in this case, everybody has just the same incentives to continue to invest. So kind of if you face a situation where nobody has ever contributed, and you know that everybody has to contribute 50%, then just when you face the situation, there's no contribution yet, it's very clear to you. And everybody else, if you assume that everybody is smart enough to realize this, we have to contribute to really reach the target, otherwise it's very bad for us. But there are complications, and kind of one complication is if you contribute too early, you complicate the situation a lot. Because if you already did something yesterday, who is allowed to compensate? Is it okay to give less because you always give more, or how do I deal with this? This is just a complication in kind of simulations, but I guess also in behavior. And also kind of different wealth complicates the situation. So what is fair if my income is twice as high as someone else's? How much should I give, and how much should that person give? Should we both give 50% of what we have, or should we kind of give as much that we have in the end the same amount of money left? That's, I mean, there's a whole literature on this kind of what is really fair, but I just want to say it complicates the situation if you think about such things. So if you think about this, the strategy give as late as possible, then of course there are assumptions in there, and that's one assumption is the risk is clearly defined, the timing is precisely known, and all players behave rationally. So they know what makes sense. I mean, rationally to me means that I think about a situation which involves somehow interaction with, say, my wife, and I think about my wife thinking about me, thinking of my wife, and so on. So it's, I mean, we really have to kind of be fully rational to really kind of make such a strategy work, and everybody has to do that. But kind of in these evolutionary models, you typically see that in the second half, there are much higher contributions than in the first half. And then, of course, there's also an influence of the number of rounds. And to analyze this, kind of we have worked with a simpler game in which you have only 2 rounds, and accordingly, just a few strategies. And also there, players tend to contribute in the second round, not in the first one, if the risk is high enough. And the strategies here would now be something like, this is kind of 0, 0, 0 is somebody who doesn't give in the first round, and I don't give if the others contributed, and I don't give if only I contributed. So there are many strategies already, and you see kind of if you increase the risk probability, you go away from defectors to people who are willing to give 50% of what they have. And there are kind of also interesting conditional strategies, like a conditional cooperator is someone who doesn't give at the start, but then if you have contributed, I also contribute. So if you have contributed in the first round, I will also contribute. But it's if I play with somebody who will never contribute, it doesn't really hurt me. Another interesting strategy is this wait and see, and that's I don't contribute, I only contribute in the second round if nobody did in the first round. And again, there you see kind of that the probability of contributions in the second round is higher than in the first round, but it requires a certain risk to start with. And you also see that increasing the number of rounds tends to increase the payoff. But increasing the number of rounds also makes the problem extremely complicated. So it's getting really hard to analyze this problem. So kind of the other thing is kind of it's not only the number of rounds, but also the risk curves. And so far, I just said you have to reach a target. So it makes no difference when you make contributions. So in this case, I just count the total contributions, but I don't ask when were they made. Of course, I can make complications to such a model. I can ask, I can say what happens if you have a certain interest, but then you can compensate again. So there are many ways to address this thing, but so far the time of contribution doesn't really matter. It's only kind of, to me, also in this previous slide, this model. So games over many rounds, they include a lot of psychology, I would say. And late contributions are one possible optimal solution. But if you have many rounds of such an interaction, then it's getting. I mean, this many rounds is something that somehow is a bit like a negotiation. So you start saying, okay, I contribute something at the start. How do people deal with it? When will I again do something? And modeling individuals that really kind of adapt to such a possibility that's it's getting easily out of hand. So you easily have kind of agents that are quite complex and they don't really capture in the end what you observe. But a second thing is here kind of this dependence on the risk on the contributions. So far I said you have to reach a certain threshold, and only if you're above that threshold, you actually reduce your risk to something very small. But in many cases, it could be that this risk curve is actually not that discontinuous. And the discontinuous risk curve, where it really goes down rapidly, is actually, at least from a theoretical perspective, a kind of special case. So let me briefly go into this issue of risk curves. I mean, I assume that if there are no questions yet, we will discuss probably mostly at the end. So this would be a kind of a different kind of model where the risk is continuous. So if your contributions are small, the risk is very high. Here I even set it to 1. And kind of if you're above a certain point, they're getting very low. But the point is this curve is continuous. And for my purposes, it's actually not only important that it's continuous, it's also differentiable, which is something that we like in my world. And if all players are equal, I can calculate now the average payoff in such a risk curve. So if everybody contributes the same thing, and if everybody contributes 0, then the risk is 1, so your payoff is 0. If you contribute all you have, so this is now the contribution in terms of your total wealth. So say you have 100 euros, and if you give 100 euros, your payoff is also 0. But in between, there's a maximum where the average payoff is highest. And so how do you calculate this payoff of a player? So you calculate this payoff of a player so this is this pi star here. You take the total wealth E minus what he has contributed, and then minus times the probability that you can actually keep what you had. And this is 1 minus, and P is now this curve, this red curve here. And this curve has kind of depends on the contribution C of the others, and their D minus 1 others, and on your own contribution. And then you divide by the number of players and their wealth, just as a normalization. So in this way, you can analyze now different red curves here and ask kind of which of them lead to most cooperation. And what you already see in this curve is the average payoff is highest here, but the arrow kind of between the gray and the white area is the point which would be stable. That's not the maximum payoff, because it's something that doesn't arise from population optimum, but from individual optimum. So on the left-hand side here, the payoff of a player will increase if you increase your contributions. And on the right-hand side, the payoff will decrease if you increase your contributions. So here you have an incentive to reduce your contribution. You go to the left, and here you go to the right, and then you will go to this black arrow in the end. And so the assumption is that everybody is the same, and this is here kind of the equation that you have to solve to calculate the optimum. And the important thing is this: you end up with a derivative of the risk curve in a certain point. And the derivative of the risk curve is important, and of course that requires that you have a curve that is somehow continuous and ideally kind of also steep. So you could now look at many other curves. So this is the one that I've shown before. You could just look at a linear risk, and they always have the property that the average payoff is 0 here, and it's 1 here if the risk goes to 1 here. And here kind of the contributions are much smaller, and the payoff would be much higher for much higher contributions. But since the curve is not very steep, you cannot really stabilize such an equilibrium. In this curve, I mean, it has the same function form as this one, but the parameter is different, so the risk is slightly lower here. And also here, kind of because it's not so steep, the average payoff is kind of high here, and the optimal solution for if everybody does the same is here. And you could also have kind of curves with 2 steps like this one, and you have 2 possible solutions, and you can come up with all kinds of curves here. And so far, I just assume you just maximize your own payoff. But in addition, you could say, no, I also want to minimize the variance of the payoff. I'm not only interested in how much I get, but also kind of what the variance around it is. And maybe I just want to make sure that maybe I'm happy with a lower income, but the income should be more secure. It should always be the same. And then I could have very different solutions that are stabilized. So how do humans react to such curves? And that's kind of this work by Christine Hagel, who worked with Manfred Milinski on experiments on this. And they looked at different such risk curves. And so I think, I'm not sure if Manfred is there. I think I saw him. Christine is definitely also here. And I mean, of course, in the discussion, it would be, yeah, this is not really my home turf. I just think this is something that is super interesting, because they have done exactly such experiments. And they see that if you have such a steep curve, you can stabilize this point. So in this blue experiment here in the first treatment, you're at around 120 with your contributions, so you can really stabilize something. With a green curve, you also have something that is down here. You don't really make the 120, but you're still down here. And with this brownish curve, it's getting very difficult to have really high contributions, but still people kind of go to a point that is still down here. So it's not 0. I mean, you see this axis here is kind of broken. So the contributions are still relatively high. But I mean, this shows that it's much easier to kind of lead to high cooperation, to have higher cooperation levels if you have these steep curves here. So at least in spirit it fits, but of course in detail these models are not suitable to really describe individual human behavior. It's more to get an idea of what actions make sense in such games. Okay, so in the last part here, I want to kind of move away from the single loss scenario. So far I just said you have to do something until a certain point, and if you meet the target, it's fine, and otherwise it's not good, or the risk goes down in a certain way. But I mean, so far I've just assumed that this goal has to be reached after R rounds to avoid a very large common loss. And this is kind of Earth on Fire picture. It's kind of a bit of a doomsday scenario to me. But you could also assume something else, and you could assume that every small contribution reduces the risk that one out of many smaller losses occurs. And this could be kind of droughts and floodings and fires and kind of all these catastrophes that we see. And kind of if we would believe that kind of these smaller catastrophes can be avoided early on, then the dynamics is actually quite different. And this has been triggered by Andreas Roschlis from Geomar and Kiel, who has kind of discussed previous models with us and said, okay, couldn't you work on something like this? So how does this work? Again, I have kind of a risk probability here, and I have contributions here, but now I have several rounds, and after each round, I say kind of, does an event occur or not? And I can start kind of by a certain amount of contributions that reduce the risk from 1 to say 0.85 or so. And then I go with every additional round and every additional contribution, I go down and down and down. And the question is, what is now the optimal behavior? How should I now act in a game? And of course, again, you can work with very different curves. And I mean, let's focus now on the which curve should let's choose the red curve first. So the risk here kind of goes down rapidly to 0 with kind of contributions of 0.1. So that means you have to give 10% to really kind of get there. If you have now a single round, and if you assume, I mean, now you cannot assume that you lose everything if you lose, because if you lose everything, it's game over. So you have to assume that only a certain amount of what you have is lost. And if this loss fraction is high enough, then you will contribute 0.1 in even in the single first round. So if it's too small, then it actually makes sense to give slightly less. And if you have more rounds, it actually kind of works with a smaller loss fraction because you have more of these events. If you instead move kind of to the blue curve here, you need many more contributions. So that means that if the loss fraction is high enough in a single round, you will contribute more, but it has to be kind of, this alpha has to be much higher. You have to lose much more from your wealth to get there. And if you have kind of more rounds, then then a smaller loss fraction is enough to kind of contribute more to reduce the risk further. So this means that this risk curve is now actually even more important than before, because increasing the number of events can really lead to much higher contributions if you have kind of recurrent events. So let's again kind of learn, okay, sorry, I didn't mention this before. Let's now, or I didn't focus on this, let's now go to such a linear risk curve where with the contributions, the risk probability goes from 1 to 0. And now there are different scenarios here. This is the color code here is the number of rounds. So there could be 1 round, 2 rounds, 4 rounds, and there are 4 scenarios. One is that in every round you have such an event. So say every year you can have this disaster, which is not destroying everything, but it's still a disaster. So you could have it in every round, only the first, only in the last, or in the random round. And the last is kind of most similar to the scenario of kind of collective risk. And every round is kind of something that, that's, I mean, it can happen all the time, but these are just for comparison. So if you have a scenario in which this happens in every round, then contributions, of course, tend to be early. So say in this 4-round game, you tend to give early on because you reduce the risk also for the future. And even in the 2-round game, you contribute most in the first round. Of course, in the 1-round game, that doesn't make much sense. If it only happens in the first round, if there's only the possibility of such an event in the first round, then the contributions stop after that because there's no point in continuing to give something. If it only happens in the last round, then it doesn't really matter when you give. So you see this in the 4-round scenario that the contributions are actually the same in every round here. And this is just, again, simulations in an evolutionary model, and we identify those strategies that are particularly robust now. So if the single event occurs in the last round, then you make contributions later, but the timing is not so important. And if it's a random round, it's actually the same, or it's very similar to something happening kind of in every round. So if you cannot really predict what is going on, then you should really act early. So of course you can do this kind of with many other risk curves, but the message here is that if you really have such a scenario where you can have something bad happening at all times, it doesn't require really steep risks. So even in this scenario where it's kind of the curve is just linear, you can have quite some level of kind of contributions in these scenarios. If you have kind of these situations, you have to contribute a lot to really reduce the risk. That is actually much harder, and you don't really kind of manage to reduce the risk to something small. This is the easiest scenario here. You have to contribute a little, and you typically do it in the first round, and then you get a risk of 0. And these curves, again, are those that I have kind of analyzed more extensively earlier. You can also kind of, if your contributions happen early on, you can kind of make the risk very low for the whole future. So if it's in every round, you start to do this very early. If you do it in a random round, it's also typically going on early, but sometimes you also contribute later to reduce the risk even further. And how you contribute is actually something that is that can be theoretically quite well understood. So coming to the end, and what do I want to say with this? And I want to say kind of something about optimal behavior in the face of risk, and optimal in the sense of kind of individuals optimize. And what would they, if you optimize your own payoff, kind of what would be the solution of the system if everybody does so? And there are two scenarios that I see as somehow kind of different. I mean, they are both relevant for certain aspects in this field. One is this threshold scenario. You have kind of, if you really know the threshold, and this is kind of somehow, yeah, maybe a bit of a theoretical picture, this is such a bistable regime. Once you're beyond a certain point, you jump down and it's very hard to go back. This is like a glacier that is just gone. And if you would know exactly when it is, then it's a good strategy to contribute as late as possible. And to really stabilize cooperation, you need a really kind of high sensitivity in these scenarios. But there's of course also this more continuous scenario, and this is kind of somehow, this is this famous graph of the CO2 concentration in Mauna Loa, which is kind of has the seasonal fluctuations, but it's just going up in a scary way. But it's, I mean, it's slow, and it's more the scenario of the frog in a kind of a pot of water that is heated, that is, you don't really realize how difficult it is. But if you work on such a scenario, then evolutionary stable solutions could be very early contributions, and this high sensitivity is not required. If you really if you understand that something like this is going on, then it makes sense to start giving very early on, because you will benefit for much longer from what you did early on. But again, this is kind of, I mostly spoke about theoretical models, because to me it's a way to understand how people would act in such scenarios, and what kind of behaviors are evoked by certain scenarios. And I'm not sure kind of, so maybe we can discuss this later, what this really means about communication of risks, because this doomsday scenario is something that was with us for a very long time. And for somebody who grew up in, say, the 1980s and had to read kind of books of Gudrun Pausewang and was kind of concerned that kind of the forest will be gone by 1990, so at some point people don't believe this anymore. So one has to be a little bit careful and maybe kind of inform people in a different way about risks. So to sum up, cooperation in public goods can be promoted by several different mechanisms, but typically these do not really work well for large populations. Okay, the ants should maybe not be here, but the larger the population, the harder it gets. And in this collective risk scenario, going back to these experimental papers by Manfred Milinski, the precise form of this risk curve can have a crucial influence on the contributions. And but in general, the details of this underlying game, of the underlying dynamics, how people interact with each other, can be very important to identify the most successful strategies. So one has to think very carefully how one sets up these things, how one wants to promote cooperation in which situation before you can really expect that something good comes out. So I should thank my current and kind of people who have just left mostly here. And Maria has been part of all of these projects. Christian and Maria have, together with Philip, kind of worked on this kind of minimal model with this timing. And Christian has been doing kind of this risk curve things and then experiments with Manfred. And Hannah and Andreas have also been together with Maria, been working on this last scenario with these risks that are continuous. Okay, and this is my end, and maybe I should stop sharing and start talking with you.
Great, thank you very much. So we would also like to invite, okay, I already see some faces. Yes, if you want to turn on your camera, especially also, of course, we're interested in the co-workers, but anyone, of course. And maybe if you can already think of questions, feel free to note them, or just also put them in the chat or say that you have a question.